Charlie Downs has joined us, a regular with us on the programme, of course, political commentator, journalist, looking at the big stories of the day. And, of course, Charlie, naturally, you join us, as every guest does this afternoon, against the backdrop of some, very devastating news of that plane crash in India. There's not really comment or opinion around this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's just horrible.
It's just horrible. Yeah. We await, the official kind of reasonings behind it. It seems that terrorism has sort of been ruled out, although I'm pretty sure authorities would say, you never know, but it's certainly not looking that way.
Well, I mean, based on some of the information that we do have, like details about the pilot and the plane itself, it looks like a mystery, basically, because this type of plane, this Boeing plane, has never gone down. Yeah, it's never gone down before, right?
Yeah,
and the pilot had 8,200 hours, in the sky and all the rest of it. So, incompetence maybe, but it doesn't look that way. And a technical fault, again maybe, but. Well, there's no precedent for it.
But it is the only form of transport that I think people get onto a plane, and they do, everybody, if they're honest, has that little thought. Yeah. It might be the week before, it might be on the day, it might be when you're up there. Because, obviously, if a plane crashes, it's very hard to survive a plane crash. You can survive a car crash or a bus crash, even a train crash. But a plane, you don't. And, without sounding too grim and not trying to be glib about this, but certainly that thought goes through your head. But it is the safest form of transport.
Yeah.
And so when it happens, it's very rare, and certainly a passenger plane of this magnitude, as you say, with almost a perfect safety record, and a pilot with immense experience, you do think that the lottery of what happens, something technically goes wrong and no one can put it right.
Yeah, it's just terrible luck, isn't it? Terrible. I mean, 53 British nationals on board as well, 11 children. Yeah. It's just a horrible story.
It's a horrible story. We are, of course, updating everyone with the latest as it comes in, but it's an emerging story, and as we get any further details, we'll bring it to you here live on the programme. Let's move to domestic matters. The riots in Ballymena, reports of a civil war. Some saying the UK should brace itself for a summer of torch cars and smashed windows. Nobody defends people who beat up the police or set fire to things and throw, bottles of flaming bottles into buildings and the like, and of course then films it for TikTok. I mean, that's almost a whole different thing. However, and it's a very, that word, however, is doing some heavy lifting here, but nonetheless, sometimes something unconventional and even desperately unrequired does actually spark a debate, and that's we had it with Southport. And we're having it with this, I think.
Well, this is the thing. The Southport riots, of course, there was the misinformation going around initially that the murderer was a illegal migrant and a Muslim. And the latter is still a little bit up in the air, but the former is definitely not the case. Yeah. And so it was on those grounds that a lot of the unrest started. But actually, it almost doesn't matter, in a way, whether those two things were true, because what these riots and protests are an expression of is what I would say is, it's white working class anguish at multiculturalism, at mass immigration, and the effect that those things are having on local communities, whether that's economically or culturally or socially. And I mean, obviously, this incident in Ballymena, is that how you say it? This was a sexual assault by two Romanians against a local girl, and I mean, that's something that England is well accustomed to. We have a sordid history of that sort of thing happening in our country as a direct result of immigration, and so it's no surprise that this sort of thing is going on. And I think, and I said this in an interview earlier this year with the New Culture Forum, I think that unless something radical is done now about mass immigration and the demographic situation in Britain and in Ireland, I think that this sort of thing is only going to get more common, more intense and worse.
Indeed, but the trouble is, and this is where it becomes sometimes an uncomfortable conversation, but you have to be honest, but politicians are not honest and they don't like being uncomfortable. Yeah. So they gloss over this, and if anybody dare to raise... It doesn't mean that all immigration or all people or all immigrants are, in fact... I think you'd have to be a half-wit not to acknowledge that probably 99% of people who come to any country are perfectly ordinary people.
And this is the thing that people get wrong, right? Is like, I don't blame immigrants for the problems caused by immigration. I mean, of course, there's individual agency and all the rest of it, but a lot of these people are just following incentives. Like, they're coming here for money or to be with family or whatever else. And so the culprit, the ultimate, the villain here is the government. It's the elites.
Oh, 100%. And of course, but you only need a small percentage in an area that's got a huge immigration area for things to kick off, whether it's about grooming gangs, and of course there is absolutely a cultural, I'm not attributing it to a religion, but I think there's certainly a culture. I mean, these were acts of sheer industrial-scale racism, if nothing else.
Totally.
From people who considered young white girls to be trash based on the colour of their skin.
On the topic of racism, I think this is so crucial because, like I said, all of this sort of thing, everything from Tommy Robinson right the way through to these riots, both of which are, you know, you don't have to support either of those things to recognise that they are an expression, a symptom of a far more fundamental problem. And as long as that problem goes unaddressed, and that problem is the white working class being totally hated by our elites, these problems aren't going to go anywhere.
And it's the kind of immigration you have, isn't it? It's literally the kind of immigration. You know, I don't think anybody's going to worry about, you know, a sort of middle-class German or a French family living next door to them. But I think if you import people from a third world culture, wherever that happens to be, and there are countries in Europe that are pretty much, you know, still a little bit out there in terms of culture, then you will experience a problem. And if you raise it, the left will go, you're a racist, we're not going to listen to you. The Prime Minister will even say you're a racist.
Far-right thuggery and all the rest of it. There's a really good report done by a Dutch professor called Jan van der Beek, who I know, he's a very good guy, called Borderless Welfare State. And in that, he goes into all of this research that he has done into what he calls cultural proximity. And he maps all the different cultures of the world on this kind of graph and shows that the more culturally proximate two nations are to one another, the better social relations are and the better, you know, when immigration takes place between those places. You know, it's more economically beneficial to have people from a more culturally proximate nation. It's more socially beneficial in terms of social trust and crime and all that sort of thing. And it doesn't take a genius to understand why that's the case, because if you're more similar to somebody culturally and in, you know, in terms of your country's relationships with one another throughout history, then it follows that things are going to be more peaceful.
The greatest example of that is pre-Brexit. I mean, we could argue about whether Tony Blair let too many people in from the EU, but we were never discussing grooming gangs and shoplifting and pickpocketing.
And this is the great betrayal of the Boris Johnson Conservative government, the Boris wave, as they call it now. This massive influx of people from the Middle East and North Africa who do not share our values, who do not respect our culture, who have no interest at all in integrating or assimilating, who bring their what I would call backwards values and ideas to our country, and surprise, surprise, things like rapes and murders go up.
Well, sometimes medieval, you know, and we can call it that. Just very quickly, two quick stories. Voters bracing for tax hikes. As sure as night follows day, Charlie, there's going to be tax hikes. You can't spend that amount of money and whipping it out of some sort of magic drawer in the Treasury.
So this story, the spending review, like I'm a big fan of the state, right? And it's not often that a Conservative will say that, but I actually think that using the state to achieve things and to build things and to improve things is a great thing to do. And I actually think that those people who obsess about having a tiny state get it wrong. I mean, I don't think we should have the state getting involved in the everyday business of people's lives, but actually doing things that improve the quality of life in the country, why not? I mean, that's the purpose of the state as far as I'm concerned. But this philosophy that underpins the way the Labour government approaches these sorts of issues, I think it's just all wrong, right? Because I mean, for one thing, who the hell is paying for any of this, right? I mean, we already borrow. I think it's so under Rachel Reeves, we're borrowing 148 billion per year, which is 200 billion extra over the next 5 years than where we were before. 30 billion going to Chagos, 15 billion housing asylum seekers, and 3.6 billion just in London on foreign-born social housing, living in social housing, which is just crazy. And there's so much of this just wasteful, nonsensical spending that goes on, and then we're told that we need to, you know, pay more into the Treasury, pay more out of, you know, our pay slips to fund this stuff. And as a young person who's looking to, you know, get on the housing ladder, who's getting married this year, as you know, and all the rest of it, I mean, this country is increasingly looking like a basket case. And why would anyone want to stay here? It's no surprise that so many young people want to leave, because they look at the options in places like Europe or, you know, or even like Dubai and Australia and places like that, where you're not going to have these punitive taxes that go to fund these nonsensical projects that just, you know, they don't benefit me in any way.
100%. Right? And then we wonder why people are angry and start doing silly stuff in the streets.
And just on the actual numbers, right? So tax revenue last year was almost £1 trillion, right? £1 trillion went into the Treasury from tax revenue, and it's going to be higher this year. 10% of that is repaying debts, right? And yet Reeves is going to borrow more, which means that our debt interest is going to go up, which means that taxes are going to go up to pay for the debt, to borrow more, and all the rest of it. And it's just this cycle that's never going to end until we get a government that's prepared. And Keir Starmer speaks in these terms, but he never actually does it. He's prepared to make hard decisions and do things that are going to make life in the short term more difficult for people, but in the long term.
He says country first, party second. Nonsense. nonsense. That's not what he's doing. We've got 20 seconds on this. Is Britain surrendering Gibraltar?
Well, it certainly looks that way. I mean, I do think people are being a bit alarmist about this, but the presence of EU officials in Gibraltar, controlling the border, essentially, that's not ideal, because I don't think the EU should be trusted to control borders.
They're saying it's just like Eurostar. You know, there's French people over there, you know, out our window over at King's Cross that, you know, are standing there with guns and French.
Well, maybe,
uniform.
but it's the latest in a long line of you know, reintegration into the EU that Starmer and co seem to want to do.
Yeah, very cynical, Charlie, but absolutely correct. Listen, thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you, Ian.
Charlie Downs with us on the programme.